Construction crew uncovers ancient safe. What's inside shocks the world. Jake Martinez pulled his old pickup truck into the construction site just as the sun started peeking over the horizon. The early morning air still had that crisp feel to it, the kind that made him grateful for the thermos of coffee riding shotgun next to him. He'd been supervising sites like this for 15 years, but something about this particular project felt different. Maybe it was the location right on the edge of Somerset, one of those small towns where everybody knew everybody and the buildings had more history than half the residents combined. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. He stepped out of his truck, boots crunching on the gravel, and took a slow look around the site. The skeletal framework of what would eventually become a shopping complex rose against the brightening sky. Their company had won the bid to develop this patch of land, which had been sitting empty for as long as anyone could remember. The locals sometimes talked about old artifacts being found in the area, mostly broken pottery and rusted coins, but nothing that ever caused more than a day's delay. The rumble of arriving vehicles broke through his thoughts as his crew started showing up. First came Emilio Rodriguez in his beat-up Honda Civic, always early, always ready to work. The kid had only been with them for 6 months, but Jake had already marked him as someone to watch. He had good instincts and wasn't afraid to ask questions when something didn't look right.
"Morning, boss,"
Emilio called out, grabbing his hard hat from the back seat. "Looks like perfect weather for digging." "Don't jinx it," Jake replied with a grin. "We've got that foundation extension to tackle today, and I'd rather not do it in the rain." More trucks and cars pulled in as the rest of the crew arrived. Tom and Sarah from the excavator team, Mike handling the bulldozer, and the rest of the ground crew, about 15 people in total. They gathered around for the morning briefing, trading jokes and complaints about Monday morning traffic while Jake pulled out his tablet to review the day's objectives. "All right, people," Jake announced, bringing the chatter to a halt. "We're behind schedule after that permit delay last week. Today we're focusing on the East Side extension. Emilio, you and Carlos start with the preliminary dig. Mark anything that looks like it needs deeper inspection before we bring in the heavy equipment." The crew dispersed to their assigned tasks, the site coming alive with the sound of machinery and shouted instructions. Jake watched as Emilio and Carlos grabbed their tools and headed to the marked section. The morning progressed smoothly, almost too smoothly, Jake thought later. That should have been his first clue that something unusual was about to happen. Around mid-morning, Jake was checking measurements on the north side when he heard Emilio calling his name. There was something in his voice that made Jake look up sharply, not panic exactly, but the kind of urgency that meant he'd better check it out right away.
"Jake,
you need to see this." Emilio was waving from the partially excavated trench, his yellow hard hat visible above the edge. Jake made his way over, noting how Emilio and Carlos had stopped digging and were both staring at something in the ground. As he got closer, he could see they'd cleared away a roughly rectangular area about 4 feet across. "What view you got?" Jake asked, peering down into the trench. The morning sun caught something metallic below, something that definitely wasn't a pipe or any of the usual underground surprises they encountered. Emilio pointed with his shovel. "At first I thought it was just some old machinery, you know? But look at these edges, they're too perfect. And these markings, I've never seen anything like them." Jake climbed down into the trench for a better look. The object they'd uncovered was partially exposed, its surface covered in dirt, but clearly showing geometric patterns that couldn't have occurred naturally. As they carefully cleared more soil away, it became apparent they were looking at some kind of safe or vault, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to shimmer when the sunlight hit them just right. The symbols were unlike anything Jake had encountered in his years of construction work. They weren't normal wear patterns or manufacturer's marks. These looked deliberate, almost like writing, but not in any language he recognized. Some appeared to be geometric shapes arranged in precise patterns, while others resembled ancient hieroglyphs he'd seen in history documentaries. "Hold up," Jake said, pulling out his phone to take pictures. "Let's get everything documented before we go any further." He turned to Carlos. "Get the site barrier tape. We need to mark this area off." Word spread quickly through the site, and soon other workers were gathering around the trench, their curiosity drawn by the unusual discovery. Sarah from the excavator team crouched at the edge, squinting down at the markings. "My sister works at the museum downtown," she offered. "Should I give her a call? She might know who to contact about something like this." Jake nodded, already pulling up the company's procedure manual on his phone. There were protocols for discovering historical artifacts, though they usually dealt with Indian burial grounds or colonial-era foundations. This felt different, more significant somehow. "All right, everyone back to work," Jake announced to the growing crowd. "Emilio, Carlos, you two stay here. We need to document everything exactly as we found it." He turned to Sarah. "Make that call to your sister. The sooner we get someone qualified to look at this, the better." As the crowd dispersed, Emilio continued carefully clearing dirt from around the safe, revealing more of its surface. The object was larger than they'd initially thought, standing about 4 feet tall and equally wide. The metal, where they could see it clearly, had an unusual luster that didn't look quite like steel or iron. "What do you think is inside it?" Carlos asked, voicing what everyone was wondering. Jake shrugged, trying to maintain a professional demeanor despite his own growing curiosity. "Could be anything or nothing. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But as the day wore on, speculation ran wild through the site. Every coffee break was filled with theories, each more outlandish than the last. Tom from the excavator team was convinced it was a Prohibition-era gangster's stash. Mike thought it might be connected to the old railroad that used to run through town, maybe a forgotten payroll vault. Even the usually quiet Carlos had a theory involving secret government experiments from the 1950s. The afternoon sun was starting to cast long shadows across the site when Sarah returned from her phone calls. "My sister's coming with Dr. Morgan from the Historical Society," she reported. "They're really interested, especially after I sent them the photos. They're asking us to secure the site overnight." Jake looked at his watch, then at the darkening sky. They'd lost most of the day's productivity to the discovery, but somehow he couldn't bring himself to be too concerned about the schedule. Something about the safe, about those strange symbols, kept drawing his attention back to the trench. "Okay, let's get some proper barriers up and rig some security lights," he decided. "Emilio, you did good spotting this. Tomorrow morning we'll have the experts here to tell us what we're dealing with." As the crew packed up for the day, Jake noticed Emilio lingering by the trench, staring down at the safe with an intense expression. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Emilio started, as if caught doing something wrong. "Just thinking, those symbols, they almost look like they're trying to tell us something. Like they're waiting for someone to figure them out." Jake clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, tomorrow we'll have people here who can hopefully do just that. Go home, get some rest. Something tells me tomorrow's going to be an interesting day." The site gradually fell quiet as the workers departed, leaving just the soft hum of the security lights and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. The safe sat silently in its earthen tomb, its mysteries still locked away behind those enigmatic symbols, waiting for morning to come. The next morning arrived with a mix of fog and anticipation. Jake got to the site an hour earlier than usual, not surprised to find Emilio already there, nursing a cup of gas station coffee and staring at the secured area. The morning dew had settled on the barrier tape, making it glisten in the weak morning light. "Couldn't sleep?" Jake asked, joining him at the edge of the trench. Emilio shook his head. "Kept thinking about those symbols. I spent half the night looking up ancient writing systems on the internet. Found some interesting stuff about cryptography, too." Before Jake could respond, a silver Prius pulled up to the site, followed by an older model Subaru. From the Prius emerged a woman in her 50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, carrying a weathered leather briefcase. The Subaru delivered a younger woman wearing what looked like hiking clothes and carrying various pieces of photography equipment. Dr. Lisa Morgan, the older woman, introduced herself, extending a hand to Jake. "And this is my colleague, Dr. Jenny Chen from the university's archaeology department. Sarah's sister called us last night, showed us the photos. I have to say, I haven't been this intrigued by a find in years." They made their way down to the trench, Dr. Morgan immediately pulling out a small notebook and beginning to sketch the symbols. Dr. Chen set up her camera equipment, taking detailed photographs from various angles. The rest of the construction crew began arriving, forming small groups at a respectful distance, watching the proceedings with obvious curiosity. "These markings are fascinating," Dr. Morgan muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "See how these lines intersect. There's definitely a pattern here, but it's unlike any ancient script I'm familiar with. Jenny, does this remind you of anything from the Mesopotamian sites?" Dr. Chin shook her head, adjusting her camera settings. "The geometric precision is too perfect for that period. And look at the metal itself, I've never seen anything quite like it. We should get some samples for analysis." As the morning wore on, more experts arrived. A metallurgist from the State University set up portable testing equipment. A linguist joined Dr. Morgan in studying the symbols, their excited discussions becoming increasingly technical. Jake watched as Emilio hovered nearby, clearly absorbing every word, occasionally jotting things down in a small notebook of his own. "The symbols appear to be some kind of hybrid system," Dr. Morgan explained when Jake asked for a layman's translation of their findings. "We're seeing elements that resemble several ancient writing systems, some cuneiform-like marks here, what might be early Chinese characters there, even some symbols that remind me of Norse runes. But they're all integrated in a way that suggests this wasn't just random copying. Whoever created this knew exactly what they were doing. Any idea how old it is?" Jake asked. Dr. Morgan shook her head. "That's what's puzzling us. The precision of the engravings suggests relatively modern tools, but the symbolism and design elements point to something much older. We need to do more analysis before we can even begin to date it properly." The construction crew was getting restless. Jake had already received 3 calls from the project manager about the delay, and he knew they couldn't keep the site shut down indefinitely. But there was something about the safe that made him hesitant to rush the process. During lunch break, he found Emilio sitting alone, still scribbling in his notebook. "What's caught your attention?" Jake asked, settling down next to him with his own sandwich. Emilio showed him the notebook. He'd been copying down sections of the symbols, trying different arrangements. "There's something about the way they're organized," he explained. "See how these patterns repeat? But they're not exactly the same each time. It's like when you're reading music. The same notes might appear in different places, but they mean different things depending on where they are in the sequence." Jake studied the drawings, impressed by their detail. "You've got a good eye for this stuff. Ever think about studying archaeology?" Emilio laughed. "Nah, couldn't afford college. Besides, I like working with my hands, building things. But this..." He gestured at the safe. "This is different. It's like a puzzle that's meant to be solved." As the afternoon progressed, the experts began packing up their equipment, promising to return the next day with more specialized tools. Dr. Morgan approached Jake with a concerned expression. "We need to keep this quiet for now," she said. "Until we understand what we're dealing with, we don't want to attract too much attention. History buffs can get enthusiastic about these things. The last thing we need is amateur treasure hunters showing up with metal detectors." Jake agreed, but he could already see some of his crew sneaking photos with their phones. In a small town like Somerset, news traveled fast. He had a feeling keeping this quiet wasn't going to be as easy as Dr. Morgan hoped. That evening, after most of the crew had left, Emilio asked if he could stay late to help Dr. Morgan document more of the symbols. Jake agreed, making a mental note of Emilio's growing involvement with the discovery. There was something about the young man's intensity that both impressed and slightly worried him. The sun was setting when Emilio finally packed up his notebook and headed for his car. But instead of going home, he drove to the local library. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Peterson, knew him from his frequent visits to the construction magazine section, and she raised an eyebrow when he asked about books on ancient languages and codes. "School project?" she asked, leading him to the relevant shelves. "Something like that," Emilio replied, already pulling books from the shelves. He spent hours there, comparing his notes to various writing systems, looking for patterns that might match what he'd seen on the safe. The library was nearly empty when Mrs. Peterson finally told him they were closing. Driving home, Emilio couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of understanding something important. The symbols kept dancing in his mind, rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. He barely slept that night, his dreams full of geometric patterns and ancient secrets. The next morning, he arrived at the site even earlier than usual. The security guard gave him a curious look but let him through. Everyone knew he was one of Jake's reliable workers. In the dim pre-dawn light, Emilio approached the safe, his notebook in hand. The symbols seemed different somehow in the shadows, revealing patterns he hadn't noticed before. He was so absorbed in his observations that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching until they were almost upon him. Startled, he ducked behind some equipment, his heart racing. Through the gap between two concrete barriers, he watched as a figure moved carefully around the safe, taking photos with a professional-looking camera. Emilio held his breath, wondering if he should call security. But before he could decide, the figure turned slightly, and in the growing morning light, he recognized Dr. Chen's distinctive hiking boots. She was apparently doing some early morning documentation of her own. As he watched, she consulted some papers she'd brought with her, comparing them to specific sections of the symbols. Her movements were quick and practiced, suggesting she'd done this before. After about 15 minutes, she packed up her camera and left as quietly as she'd come. Emilio waited until he was sure she was gone before emerging from his hiding place. His mind was racing with questions. Why was Dr. Chen here so early, working alone? What had she seen in those symbols that required such secretive documentation? He pulled out his phone to check the time and realized he had several missed texts from Jake. The morning crew would be arriving soon. As he hurried back to his car to get his work gear, Emilio made a decision. He would keep quiet about what he'd seen, but he would also pay closer attention to Dr. Chen's activities around the safe. Something told him she knew more about those symbols than she was letting on. During his lunch break, Emilio couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen that morning. He found a quiet spot behind the site office and pulled out his notebook, reviewing his notes from the past few days. The more he studied the patterns, the more convinced he became that they weren't just decorative. They were instructions. He waited until most of the crew had left for the day before approaching Jake, who was finishing up some paperwork in the site office. Through the window, they could see Dr. Morgan's team packing up their equipment, getting ready to head out. "Got a minute?" Emilio asked, hovering in the doorway. Jake looked up from his computer, noting the serious expression on Emilio's face. "What's on your mind?" Emilio closed the door behind him and pulled up a chair. "I think I figured something out about the safe." He opened his notebook, spreading out several pages of carefully drawn symbols. "Look at these sequences here. They're not random. They're repeating in a specific pattern, like a combination lock." Jake leaned forward, studying the drawings. "How sure are you about this?" "Pretty sure," Emilio replied, pointing to specific symbols. "See these circular patterns? They appear 4 times, always in groups of 3. And these lines connecting them? They're not just decorative, they're showing direction. Clockwise, counterclockwise." He paused, then added, "I think they're telling us how to open it." Jake sat back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "Have you told Dr. Morgan about this?" Emilio shook his head.
Not yet.
"I wanted to run it by you first." He hesitated, then continued. "Thing is, I saw Dr. Chen here early this morning, before anyone else arrived. She was taking photos of these exact same sequences. I think she might have figured it out too, but she's keeping it to herself." Jake frowned. "That's interesting. But we can't just try to open it without authorization." "There are protocols, Dash, I know," Emilio interrupted. "But what if we're not the only ones who figured this out? What if someone else tries to break into it when nobody's around?" The concern wasn't entirely unfounded. Despite Dr. Morgan's wishes for secrecy, word had gotten out about the discovery. Local news had already done a small piece on it, and there had been increased traffic past the site, people slowing down to try to catch a glimpse of the mysterious safe. Jake studied Emilio's notes more carefully. The kid had always shown attention to detail in his work, but this level of analysis surprised him. The drawings were meticulous, with small annotations marking repeated patterns and possible sequences. "Let me make a few calls," Jake finally said. "See if we can get someone out here first thing tomorrow to hear your theory." In the meantime, Dash, a knock on the office door interrupted him. It was Carlos, looking worried. "Boss, you better come see this. There's some guys with cameras trying to get past the security barrier." Jake cursed under his breath, gathering his keys. "Stay here," he told Emilio. "We'll finish this conversation later." But by the time Jake returned from dealing with the would-be trespassers, Emilio had already left for the day. His notebook, however, sat conspicuously on Jake's desk, open to a page with a clearly marked sequence of numbers and arrows. Jake stared at the notebook for a long moment before picking up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Tom's number. Tom had been with the company longer than anyone else, and Jake trusted his judgment. "Hey," Jake said when Tom answered. "You still around the site? Good. Meet me by the safe in 10 minutes. And grab Carlos if you see him. We might need an extra pair of eyes." The sun was setting as the three men gathered around the safe. The security lights had kicked in, casting harsh shadows across the symbols that now seemed to glow with an almost ethereal quality in the artificial light. "So, what's this about?" Tom asked, glancing nervously at the security cameras that had been installed around the perimeter. Jake showed them Emilio's notebook. "Our young friend thinks he's cracked the code. And after looking at his work, I'm inclined to believe he might be right." Carlos whistled softly. "Are we really thinking about trying to open it? What about Dr. Morgan and her team?" "Way I see it," Jake replied, "if Emilio could figure this out, others can too. Better we try it now, under controlled conditions, than risk someone breaking in and damaging it trying to force it open." Tom studied the safe surface, running his flashlight over the symbols. "These markings here, they do look like they could be directional indicators. And look at these grooves. They're worn in specific spots, like they've been used before." Jake pulled out his phone and started recording video. "If we're going to do this, we need to document everything. Carlos, keep watch. Tom, you and I will follow Emilio's sequence." The first attempt yielded nothing but the soft scraping of metal against metal. The second try produced a few promising clicks, but no movement. On the third attempt, following the sequence exactly as Emilio had drawn it, they heard a distinct mechanical sound from deep within the safe. "Hold up," Tom whispered, pressing his ear against the metal surface. "I think something's shifting inside." They waited, barely breathing, as more clicks and whirs emanated from the safe. Then, with a soft hiss, a section of the front panel shifted slightly outward. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake muttered. The kid actually figured it out. The panel, once released, revealed 3 smaller compartments, each sealed with what appeared to be secondary doors marked with their own sets of symbols. The metal was cool to the touch and had the same strange luster they'd noticed on the exterior. "Should we try opening these too?" Tom asked, reaching toward one of the compartment doors. Jake caught his arm. "No, we've gone far enough for tonight. We need to let the experts handle this part." He started taking photos of the revealed compartments, making sure to document everything exactly as they'd found it. Carlos, who had been keeping watch, suddenly tensed. "Someone's coming." They quickly gathered their equipment, but before they could step away from the safe, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" It was Emilio's voice. He emerged from the shadows, looking both surprised and somehow knowing at the same time. "I had a feeling you might try it," he said, approaching the safe. "Did it work?" Jake showed him the open panel. "Your sequence was spot on. But listen, we need to keep this quiet until what?" Another voice cut through the darkness, making them all jump. Dr. Chen stepped into the light, her camera hanging around her neck. "Until you've had a chance to remove whatever's inside." The tension in the air was palpable as Dr. Chen approached, her expression unreadable. She studied the open panel, then turned to Emilio. "I saw your notes yesterday when you were working with Dr. Morgan. I knew it wouldn't take you long to figure it out." She smiled slightly. "I've been watching the site at night, making sure nobody tried to break in. Though I didn't expect it to be the site supervisor himself making the first attempt. We were just trying to dash," Jake began, but Dr. Chen held up a hand. "I know exactly what you were trying to do," she said. "And you were right. We've already had 2 attempted break-ins that the security guard stopped. The longer we waited, the more likely someone would have damaged it trying to get in." She pulled out her phone. "I'll call Dr. Morgan. She won't be happy about being woken up, but she needs to see this." Within an hour, the site was buzzing with activity despite the late hour. Dr. Morgan arrived with several assistants, and they began the painstaking process of documenting and photographing every detail of the open panel and the revealed compartments. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," Dr. Morgan murmured, examining one of the compartment doors. "These secondary seals, they're using a completely different symbolic system. It's like each layer was designed to test the knowledge of whoever was trying to access it." By morning, the site had transformed into something resembling a research station. Dr. Morgan had called in additional experts, and portable lights illuminated the area around the safe as they worked through the pre-dawn hours. Emilio sat on an overturned bucket, watching as they photographed and measured every inch of the newly revealed compartments. "You should go home, get some rest," Jake told him, offering a cup of coffee from the latest supply run. Emilio shook his head, accepting the coffee. "I want to see what's in those compartments." Dr. Morgan had been working nonstop, her excitement barely contained as she coordinated with her team. She'd already filmed several video calls with colleagues around the world, sharing close-up footage of the symbols on the internal compartments. "The secondary encryption system is fascinating," she explained to the group gathered around. "It appears to be using mathematical principles that weren't supposed to be understood until centuries after these kinds of metals could be worked. It's impossible, frankly. But you can decode it, right?" Emilio asked, unable to keep the eagerness from his voice. Dr. Morgan smiled tiredly. "With time, yes. But we need to be methodical about this. These compartments might contain documents or artifacts that could be damaged by exposure to air. We need to set up proper containment protocols before we proceed." The sun was fully up when Emilio finally gave in to exhaustion and headed home. He barely made it to his bed before falling asleep, his dreams filled with spinning symbols and secret chambers. When he woke up in the late afternoon, he had several missed calls from Jake and one from a number he didn't recognize. He called Jake first. "What's up, boss? How fast can you get back to the site?" Jake's voice was tense. Dr. Morgan's team opened one of the compartments. "You're going to want to see this." Emilio made it back to the site in record time. The area around the safe was now enclosed in a makeshift tent, with air filtration equipment humming nearby. He had to sign several forms before they let him enter. Inside, Dr. Morgan and her team were huddled around a table, examining what looked like a stack of impossibly thin metal sheets. Each sheet was covered in more of the mysterious symbols, but these were different from the ones on the safe, more fluid, almost like handwriting. Emilio." Dr. Morgan looked up as he entered. "Perfect timing. We could use your eye for patterns." She gestured to the metal sheets. "These appear to be some kind of documentation, but the writing system is even more complex than what we found on the exterior. We're seeing references to astronomical alignments, mathematical sequences, and what might be geographical coordinates." Emilio leaned in for a closer look. The symbols seemed to shift and flow across the metallic surface, catching the light in strange ways. "Have you figured out what they're made of?" Dr. Chun, who had been taking microscopic photographs of the sheets, shook her head. "The metallurgical analysis is inconclusive. The atomic structure doesn't match anything in our databases. It's like nothing we've ever seen before." A commotion outside the tent drew their attention. Jake stuck his head in, looking worried. "Dr. Morgan? There's a news van pulling up outside the fence. Looks like Channel 8. Dr. Morgan straightened up, her expression darkening. "How did they find out?" "We've been so careful about Dash." She stopped, noticing several of the younger research assistants suddenly looking very interested in their shoes. "Did someone post about this on social media?" The guilty silence was answer enough. Dr. Morgan rubbed her temples, clearly fighting off a headache.
Right.
Dr. Chun, secure these sheets in the containment unit. Nobody talks to the press without authorization, understood? Jake, can you handle the reporters? But it was already too late. By the time Jake made it to the fence, 2 more news vans had arrived. Phones were out, cameras were rolling, and curious onlookers were starting to gather. Someone had launched a drone that was now hovering over the site, its camera pointed directly at their tent. "This is exactly what we were trying to avoid," Dr. Morgan muttered, watching the growing crowd through a gap in the tent. "Once this hits the news, every amateur archaeologist and treasure hunter in the state will be trying to get in here." The situation escalated quickly. By evening, social media was buzzing with theories about the safe and its contents. Local news stations ran special reports, featuring interviews with random people on the street sharing their wild speculations. Someone started a Reddit thread that quickly went viral, attracting attention from archaeology and conspiracy theory communities alike. Emilio found himself avoiding his usual spots in town. The diner where he usually got breakfast, the gym where he worked out, everywhere he went, people were talking about the discovery. Worse, some had recognized him from footage of the construction site and kept trying to pump him for information. At work, the atmosphere had changed completely. The construction project was effectively on hold, with the site now resembling a research facility more than a building project. Security had been doubled, but that didn't stop people from trying to sneak in. Jake had to deal with 3 separate incidents of trespassing in one day alone. "We need to move everything to a secure facility," Dr. Morgan announced during an emergency meeting. "The university has offered their archaeology lab. We can set up proper containment there, away from all this circus." "What about the other compartments?" Emilio asked. They still hadn't opened the remaining 2 chambers, partly due to the chaos of managing the media situation. "That's why I called this meeting," Dr. Morgan replied. "We've detected environmental changes inside those compartments. Whatever's in there has been sealed away for who knows how long. Exposure to modern air and humidity levels could cause deterioration. We need to get them open and properly preserved as soon as possible." Jake leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" "We need to create a diversion," Dr. Chen suggested. "Make it look like we're still working on the translation while we actually focus on opening those compartments. The media attention is making it impossible to work effectively." They developed a plan. The research team would publicly announce that they were bringing in additional experts to study the symbols, suggesting it could take weeks or months to decode the remaining compartments. Meanwhile, a smaller team would work through the night to carefully open and document the contents. Emilio found himself part of this core team, his eye for patterns proving invaluable as they worked on decoding the new sets of symbols. The work was painstaking, with each potential combination having to be carefully documented before being attempted. "Look at this sequence," he pointed out to Dr. Morgan late one night. "It's similar to what we found on the first compartment, but there's an additional layer of complexity. It's like each chamber has its own unique puzzle that builds on the previous one." Dr. Morgan nodded, making notes. "It's not just a security system, it's a test. Whoever created this wanted to ensure that only someone who fully understood the previous chamber could access the next one." As they worked, the media circus outside grew increasingly frenzied. Amateur historians posted lengthy videos analyzing every visible detail of the safe. Conspiracy theories flourished online, ranging from alien technology to lost civilizations. The local police had to set up barriers to keep the growing crowds of onlookers at a safe distance. The pressure to work quickly while maintaining scientific rigor was intense. Every morning brought new challenges, reporters trying to sneak past security, government officials demanding updates, and endless calls from museums and research institutions around the world, all wanting to claim some part of the discovery. Through it all, Emilio couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Each night, as he helped document and decode the symbols, he felt like they were being watched, not just by the curious public, but by something else, as if the safe itself was waiting to see if they were worthy of its secrets. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m, during one of their marathon decoding sessions. Dr. Morgan had fallen asleep at her makeshift desk, surrounded by printouts and tablets displaying various analytical models. Emilio was on his 5th cup of coffee, staring at the symbols until they began to swim before his eyes, when something clicked. "Dr. Morgan," he called out softly, then louder when she didn't stir. "Dr. Morgan, I think I found something." She jerked awake, pushing her reading glasses back up her nose. "What is it?" Emilio spread out several sheets of their translations. "We've been thinking about these symbols as a language, right? But what if they're not just words? What if they're coordinates?" He pointed to a recurring pattern in the metal sheets they'd recovered from the first compartment. "See how these symbols keep appearing in groups of 4? At first, I thought they were just marking sections of text, but look at this." He pulled up a global map on his tablet. "If you treat each group as a set of coordinates, they create a pattern. Not random points, they're marking something specific. Dr. Morgan leaned in, suddenly wide awake. These could be latitude and longitude markers, but these aren't using any modern measurement system. No, Emilio agreed, but if you adjust for historical methods of measuring distance and direction. He pulled up another document, this one showing ancient navigation techniques. They form a perfect circle around a specific region. And look where the center point is. Dr. Morgan's eyes widened as she followed his calculations. The mountains just outside of town. But that's impossible. Those mountains weren't even mapped until the 1800s. They spent the next hour verifying the calculations, double and triple checking their work. The more they dug into it, the clearer the pattern became. The documents weren't just recording history, they were providing directions. By sunrise, they had called in the rest of the core team. Dr. Chen arrived with fresh coffee and pastries, looking both exhausted and excited. If you're right about this, she said, studying their work, it means whoever created these documents had access to incredibly accurate geographical knowledge long before this area was supposedly explored. Jake joined them shortly after, having dealt with the morning security changeover. So, what exactly are we looking at here? Some kind of treasure maps. Not exactly, Dr. Morgan replied. These coordinates, combined with the text we've managed to translate, they're describing some kind of network. Trading routes, meeting points, and what appears to be a central location, a chamber or vault of some kind, hidden in the mountains. Like a backup system, Emilio suggested. The safe wasn't meant to hold the real treasure, it was meant to point the way to it. They gathered around a topographical map of the region, marking the points indicated by the coordinates. The pattern was undeniable, a series of locations forming concentric circles, all centered on a specific area in the mountains about 20 miles from town. There's more, Dr. Morgan added, pulling out one of the metal sheets. The text here talks about guardians and keepers of knowledge. It seems this wasn't just about hiding valuable objects, it was about preserving information. Scientific knowledge, historical records, cultural artifacts, all protected by some kind of ancient organization. An ancient organization that had technology we can barely understand even now, Dr. Chen pointed out, holding up one of the metal sheets. These documents alone are beyond our current metallurgical capabilities. Whatever else they were protecting must be extraordinary. Jake rubbed his chin thoughtfully. So, what's our next move? We can't exactly start digging up the mountains without permits, and if we try to get official permission, the whole world will know about it before we can even start, Dr. Morgan finished. And we've already seen what that kind of attention brings. They spent the rest of the morning debating their options. The media presence outside had only grown, with international news crews now joining the local stations. The internet was full of amateur sleuths trying to piece together the mystery from leaked photos and speculation. We need to move fast, Dr. Chen insisted. The longer we wait, the more likely someone else will figure out what we've found. These coordinates aren't exactly encrypted. Anyone with the right background could make the same connections we did. Emilio had been quiet for a while, studying the maps. I know those mountains, he finally said. Used to go hiking there with my dad when I was a kid. There are lots of caves, but most of them were mapped by local climbing groups years ago. Most of them, Dr. Morgan repeated thoughtfully. But maybe not all of them. The documents mention specific astronomical alignments, times when certain stars would be visible from exact locations. If we combine those with the coordinates. They worked through the afternoon, correlating the astronomical data with geographical features. The mountain area they were focusing on was relatively undeveloped, with only a few hiking trails cutting through the dense forest. Here, Emilio pointed to a specific section of the map. This ridge line matches the description in the documents. And look at the timing. During the summer solstice, the sun would set exactly behind that peak, lining up with these other markers. Dr. Morgan was already pulling up historical weather data on her laptop. The forecast for the next few days is clear. If we move quickly, we might be able to verify these locations before anyone else makes the connection. We'll need cover, Jake said. Something to explain why we're not working on the safe anymore, without raising suspicions. Dr. Chen smiled. Actually, I might have an idea about that. The university's been pressing for the safe to be moved to their secure facility. What if we appeared to give in? make a big show of preparing it for transport, get all the media attention focused on that. While a small team checks out the mountain location, Emilio finished catching on. Dr. Morgan looked around at their small group. This stays between us. No phones, no communications that could be traced or intercepted. We'll need climbing gear, survey equipment. I can handle that, Jake offered. Construction companies buy that kind of stuff all the time. Won't raise any flags. As they worked out the details of their plan, Emilio felt a growing sense of anticipation. The safe had been just the beginning, a test really. The real discovery was still waiting for them, hidden somewhere in those mountains, preserved by people who had possessed knowledge and capabilities that shouldn't have been possible for their time. One more thing, Dr. Morgan added, her expression serious. Those documents didn't just give directions, they included warnings. Whatever we find up there, it was hidden for a reason. We need to be prepared for the possibility that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The gravity of her words settled over the group. They had started this journey thinking they'd found an interesting historical artifact. Now they were on the verge of discovering something that could change their understanding of human history and capabilities. The question was, were they ready for what they might find? The plan was set to begin the next morning. They had everything arranged, the equipment carefully purchased through various construction supply companies, the cover story about moving the safe prepared for the media. But as Jake pulled into the site before dawn, he immediately knew something was wrong. There were too many vehicles in the parking lot, including several black SUVs he didn't recognize. His phone buzzed with a text from Emilio. Feds are here. Inside the research tent, Dr. Morgan was engaged in what looked like a heated discussion with a group of official-looking people in suits. Her usually composed demeanor was cracking, her voice rising enough to be heard outside the tent. This is a scientific discovery, not a matter of national security. Jake approached slowly, catching Dr. Chen's eye. She shook her head slightly, warning him to keep his distance. Through the tent's opening, he could see the metal sheets from the safe's first compartment being carefully packed into specialized containers. Emilio appeared at his side, speaking in a low voice. They showed up about 20 minutes ago. Government agents. Didn't say which agency. They've got some kind of emergency order to take control of the site and all the artifacts. One of the suits broke away from the group and approached them. Mr. Martinez? I'm Agent Roberts. We'll need you to gather your crew and clear the site. This area is now under federal jurisdiction. Jake straightened up, using his best site supervisor voice. I'm going to need to see some paperwork for that. We have contracts, schedules, all being handled through your company's legal department. Agent Roberts interrupted smoothly, handing him a business card. They can address any questions about compensation for the delays. For now, I need this site cleared of all non-essential personnel within the hour. Inside the tent, Dr. Morgan had stopped arguing and was now watching with barely contained fury as her research materials were packed up. Dr. Chen stood beside her, frantically typing on her phone, presumably trying to contact someone who could intervene. Emilio moved closer to Jake. What about the coordinates? All our research about the mountain locations. Don't mention that, Jake muttered. Not here. Meet me at Carlo's Diner in 2 hours. The next couple of hours were a blur of activity. Construction equipment was moved off-site. Research materials were boxed up and loaded into government vehicles, and the safe itself was carefully prepared for transport. The media crews outside were having a field day, broadcasting live as unmarked trucks and more official vehicles arrived. At Carlo's Diner, Jake found Emilio already waiting in a back booth, along with Dr. Chen. She looked up as he approached, her expression grim. Dr. Morgan's been served with a gag order, she said without preamble. We all have. They're claiming potential national security implications due to the unknown origin and composition of the artifacts. What about our notes about the mountain location? Emilio asked. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. Officially, all my research data was on the university servers, which they've already seized. Unofficially, she patted her laptop bag. I always keep redundant backups of everything. Paper copies too, old school style. Jake settled into the booth, ordering coffee when the waitress passed by. So, what exactly are we dealing with here? Why would the government suddenly take such an interest? The metallurgical analysis, Dr. Chen explained. The composition of those metal sheets, it's not just unusual, it's technically impossible. The atomic structure suggests manufacturing capabilities that don't exist even today. When that report hit the university's system, it set off some kind of alarm, Jake finished. But they can't just shut down an archaeological dig because of some weird metal, can they? They can if they classify it as a matter of national security, Dr. Chen replied. Which they just did. The question is, what do we do now? They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of their situation sinking in. Through the diner's window, they could see more news vans arriving at the construction site in the distance. We still have the coordinates, Emilio said finally. And our research about the astronomical alignments. The solstice is in 3 days. If whatever's up there has been hidden this long, maybe it should be found by people who actually care about what it means, not just its strategic value. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Because that would be a violation of multiple federal orders. Can't violate an order to not look for something if we already know where it is, Jake pointed out. They've got the safe and the documents. Fine. But they don't know what we figured out before they showed up. Dr. Morgan would never approve, Dr. Chen said, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. Then we don't tell her, Emilio replied. Better she has genuine deniability. But you've seen what's in those documents. This isn't just about some ancient artifacts. This is about knowledge that was preserved for a reason, meant to be found by people who could understand it, not locked away in some government warehouse. Jake studied the young man who, just a week ago, had been just another construction worker on his crew. The events of the past few days had changed something in Emilio, awakened a determination that went beyond mere curiosity. If we do this, Jake said slowly, we need to be smart about it. No phones, no electronic equipment that could be tracked. We go in as regular hikers, nothing that would attract attention. Dr. Chen pulled out a paper map from her bag, spreading it on the table. The coordinates point to this area. There's a hiking trail that gets within 2 miles of the location. We could approach from here, stay off the main paths. They spent the next hour planning, using their collective knowledge, Jake's experience with terrain and equipment, Dr. Chen's scientific expertise, and Emilio's familiarity with the local mountains. They agreed to gather what they needed separately, using cash only, and meet before dawn in 3 days. As they prepared to leave the diner, Dr. Chen paused. You know, if we find anything up there, we can never tell anyone about it. Not if we don't want to end up in federal custody. Emilio nodded. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. The documents talked about guardians and keepers of knowledge. Maybe finding it is only part of the responsibility. They parted ways, each lost in their own thoughts about what they were about to undertake. The construction site was visible in the distance, now surrounded by official vehicles and barriers. The safe that had started everything was probably already gone, on its way to some secure facility where it would be studied in secret. But the real secret, they hoped, was still waiting to be found, hidden in the mountains that had kept it safe for centuries. In 3 days, they would either make the discovery of a lifetime or find themselves facing serious federal charges. Either way, there would be no turning back. The pre-dawn air was sharp with the smell of pine as 3 figures met at the nearly empty parking lot of the Mountain View Trail. They had arrived in separate vehicles, parking far apart to avoid drawing attention. Jake carried what looked like standard hiking gear, while Emilio and Dr. Chen had similar backpacks. To any early morning hikers, they would appear to be just another group heading out for a day in the mountains. Everyone clear on the story if anyone asks. Jake checked as they gathered at the trailhead. Just friends doing a summer solstice hike, Emilio confirmed, adjusting his pack. Nothing suspicious about wanting to watch the sunrise from the mountains. Dr. Chen pulled out their paper map, now weathered and creased to look well used. The first marker should be about 3 hours in, assuming our calculations are correct. They set off just as the sky began to lighten, following the main trail at first. The morning was quiet except for the crunch of their boots on the path and the occasional call of early birds. None of them mentioned the government vehicles they'd spotted parked at various points along the road to the trailhead. After an hour of hiking, they reached the point where they needed to leave the marked trail. Jake took the lead, using his construction experience to identify the safest path through the increasingly rough terrain. The forest was dense here, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles that made their progress almost silent. "Hold up," Emilio called softly, pointing to a rock formation ahead. "See that outcropping? The way it's shaped, it matches one of the symbols from the safe." They approached carefully. The rock formation did indeed have an unusual shape, with straight edges that seemed almost too regular to be natural. Dr. Chen ran her hands over the surface, brushing away years of moss and lichen. "There's something here," she murmured, fingers finding slight indentations in the rock. Carved symbols, badly weathered, but definitely man-made. They spent several minutes documenting the find, Dr. Chen making careful sketches in her notebook. The symbols were similar to those they'd found on the safe, but simpler, more geometric. "Trail markers," Emilio suggested, like breadcrumbs leading the way. They continued on, now moving more slowly, paying careful attention to their surroundings. The terrain became increasingly challenging, with steep inclines and unstable ground. The forest around them had changed too, the trees older here, their trunks massive and gnarled. "Check the time," Dr. Chen reminded them periodically. The alignment they were counting on would only last for a brief window around noon, when the sun reached its highest point. Around mid-morning, they found another marked rock, this one partially hidden beneath a fallen tree. The symbols here were better preserved, protected from the elements by the tree's cover. "These are different," Dr. Chen noted, comparing them to her sketches. "More complex. I think, yes, look at how they're arranged. They're not just markers, they're warnings." "Warnings about what?" Jake asked, scanning the surrounding forest uneasily. Before she could answer, a distant sound made them all freeze, the unmistakable whop-whop of helicopter blades.
Down.
Jake hissed, though they were well covered by the forest canopy. They waited, barely breathing, as the sound passed overhead and faded into the distance. "They're searching the area," Dr. Chen whispered. "They must have figured out the coordinates too. Or they're following us," Jake added grimly. "We need to move faster." They picked up their pace, pushing through the increasingly dense undergrowth. The temperature had risen, but under the thick canopy, it remained cool and dim. The forest floor was different here too, with strange depressions and mounds that seemed too regular to be natural. "Look at the ground," Emilio said suddenly, stopping short. "These aren't random patterns. They're foundations, old ones, completely overgrown. But they're everywhere." They were standing in what must have once been some kind of settlement. Now barely visible beneath centuries of forest growth, the geometric patterns of ancient walls and structures could still be traced in the earth. Dr. Chen pulled out the coordinates again, checking their position. "We're getting close. The main chamber should be somewhere just ahead, built into the mountainside itself." The helicopter's sound returned, closer this time. They pressed themselves against a rocky outcropping, waiting for it to pass. Through gaps in the canopy, they could see it was a black military-style craft, moving in a search pattern. "They're definitely looking for something," Jake muttered. "And they're getting closer to this area." They moved on as soon as the helicopter passed, now actively looking for any sign of an entrance. The mountainside here was steep, with various natural caves and crevices visible among the rocks. "Wait," Emilio called out, pointing to a particular section of rock face. "That pattern in the stone, it's not natural." They approached carefully. What had appeared to be random cracks in the rock face actually formed a subtle but distinct pattern, similar to the symbols they'd seen on the safe. Dr. Chen ran her hands over the surface, pressing at various points. "There's something here, definitely engineered, but I can't figure out how to dash the alignment," Emilio interrupted, checking his watch. "We've got maybe 20 minutes until the solstice alignment. Remember what the document said about the Guardians? They didn't just hide their secrets, they used nature itself to protect them." Understanding dawned on their faces. They stepped back, studying the rock face from different angles. The sun was now high overhead, filtering through the canopy in scattered beams. "There," Jake pointed to a small opening high in the rocks. "That gap in the stones, when the sun hits it just right." They waited, watching as the sun slowly moved into position. The forest had gone oddly quiet, as if holding its breath. Even the distant sound of helicopters had faded away. Suddenly, a beam of sunlight shot through the gap in the rocks, striking the carved surface at exactly the right angle. The effect was immediate and stunning. What had appeared to be natural cracks in the stone now stood out in sharp relief, revealing a complex pattern of interconnected symbols. "It's not just decorative," Dr. Chin breathed, quickly sketching the pattern. "It's instructions. Look at how the lines connect. It's showing us which sections move, and in what order." Emilio was already running his hands over the newly revealed pattern, pressing carefully at specific points. There was a grinding sound from deep within the rock, and a section of the wall began to shift. "My God," Jake whispered as the ancient mechanism slowly revealed an opening. They actually built this to last all this time, waiting for someone to figure it out. The passage beyond was dark, but they could feel a rush of cool air from within. Their flashlights revealed carved steps leading down into the mountain itself. The sound of helicopters returned, much closer now. "We need to decide right now," Jake said urgently. "Once we go in there, there's no turning back. And those helicopters are getting closer." Emilio was already pulling out his flashlight. "We didn't come all this way to turn back now. Whatever's down there, it was meant to be found, just not by people who want to lock it away." Dr. Chin nodded, her scientific curiosity overriding any remaining hesitation. "The entrance will probably seal itself once the sun moves past the alignment point. We've got maybe 10 minutes to make our decision." They looked at each other, each understanding the magnitude of what they were about to do. Then, without another word, they switched on their flashlights and entered the mountain's dark mouth, leaving the sound of searching helicopters behind. The passage descended steeply into the mountain, the air growing cooler with each step. Their flashlight beams revealed walls covered in the same strange symbols they'd found on the safe, but here they were perfectly preserved, as crisp as if they'd been carved yesterday. The stairs themselves were engineering marvels, cut with such precision that not a single one had crumbled despite the centuries. "Look at the walls," Dr. Chin whispered, her voice filled with awe. "These aren't just decorative. They're telling a story, the same story that was in those metal sheets, but with so much more detail." They could hear the grinding of stone above them as the entrance sealed itself, cutting off the last traces of natural light. The sound of the helicopters was completely muffled now, leaving them in a silence, so complete they could hear their own heartbeats. "No going back now," Jake said, his voice steady despite the situation. "How far down do you think this goes?" Before anyone could answer, they reached a landing where the passage opened into a larger chamber. As their flashlight beams swept the space, they all stopped dead in their tracks. The chamber was enormous, far larger than should have been possible given the mountain's exterior. But it wasn't the size that left them speechless. It was what filled it. Rows upon rows of metallic cases similar to the safe they'd found, each covered in symbols, each perfectly preserved. But these were just the beginning. The walls were lined with what looked like sheets of that same impossible metal they'd found in the first safe, but these were massive, floor to ceiling, covered in detailed diagrams and writing. Between the rows of cases stood pedestals holding objects that defied explanation, devices made of materials they'd never seen before, their purposes mysterious, but their craftsmanship undeniable. "This is impossible," Dr. Chin breathed, her scientific skepticism warring with what she was seeing. "The metallurgy alone, and look at the preservation. There's no dust, no decay." "How?" Emilio had moved to one of the walls, studying the massive metal sheets. "These are star charts," he said excitedly. "But they're showing configurations that aren't right, or weren't right for hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago." They spread out carefully through the chamber, each drawn to different aspects of the incredible collection. Jake found what appeared to be architectural drawings showing buildings and machines that seemed centuries ahead of their time. Dr. Chin was examining something that looked disturbingly like advanced mathematical equations for principles that hadn't been discovered until the modern era. The center of the chamber held what appeared to be some kind of control panel, its surface covered in the now familiar symbols. As they gathered around it, they noticed a slight vibration coming from somewhere deep within the mountain. It's still active, Dr. Chen said in disbelief. Whatever power source they used, it's still running after all this time. Emilio had pulled out his notebook and was frantically copying down symbols. These aren't just records, he said, his voice trembling with excitement. They're instructions, warnings, information about everything. Science, history, mathematics, astronomy, but not just what we know. What we've forgotten. What we never knew in the first place. A soft hum filled the chamber, and lights they hadn't noticed began to glow along the walls, bringing the vast space into full illumination for the first time. The effect was stunning. The metal surfaces caught the light in ways that made the symbols seem to move and shift, creating patterns that drew the eye and challenged the mind. We need to document everything, Dr. Chen said, already pulling out her notebook. There's no telling when or if we'll be able to come back here. Jake was examining the entrance they'd come through. The door sealed itself completely. Looks like it won't open again until the next solstice alignment. We've got some time, but we need to be smart about this. They worked systematically, recording as much as they could. Dr. Chen focused on the scientific documents, particularly the mathematical and astronomical information. Emilio documented the symbols and their patterns, looking for keys to their meaning. Jake, with his practical experience, concentrated on the architectural and engineering drawings. Hours passed as they worked, the humming of the chamber's ancient power source their constant companion. They found more rooms branching off from the main chamber, each containing different categories of information and artifacts. One held what appeared to be medical knowledge, another contained detailed maps of places that shouldn't have existed in ancient times. Look at this, Emilio called from one of the smaller chambers. He was standing in front of what appeared to be a message, carved more simply than the other symbols. Dr. Chen hurried over to help translate. To those who find this place, she read slowly, you have proven yourselves worthy of the knowledge preserved here. We are not gods or aliens or supernatural beings. We are you, humanity, as we once were and as we might be again. This knowledge was hidden not to keep it from you, but to keep it for you, protected until it could be understood without fear, used without destruction. They stood in silence, letting the weight of those words sink in. Everything around them, the impossible metal, the advanced mathematics, the preserved power sources, it wasn't alien technology. It was human knowledge, preserved from a time before recorded history, protected and passed down by generations of secret guardians. We can't let this be locked away in some government facility, Emilio said finally. This wasn't meant to be classified or controlled. It was meant to be learned from, understood. Jake nodded slowly. But we can't just announce it to the world either. Look at what happened with just that one safe. Imagine the chaos if people knew about all this. Then we do what they did, Dr. Chen said, gesturing to the message. We become the new guardians. We learn, we understand, and we find ways to introduce this knowledge gradually, in ways that can be accepted and used wisely. They spent the next several hours making copies of the most important documents, focusing on information that could be understood and potentially used in the present day. They found what appeared to be a mechanism for sealing and unsealing the entrance without waiting for the solstice alignment, another test of worthiness, proving that those who found this place could understand its principles. As they finally prepared to leave, they made a pact. They would protect this place, keep its location secret, but find ways to share its knowledge responsibly. Dr. Chen would publish carefully selected scientific findings through her academic work. Jake would incorporate some of the engineering principles into his construction projects. Emilio, who had discovered his true calling through all of this, would begin studying archaeology and ancient languages. The sun was setting by the time they emerged from the mountain. The helicopters were gone, the forest quiet once again. They carefully concealed the entrance, though they now knew it hardly needed their help staying hidden. Walking back down the mountain, they were different people than when they had climbed up. They carried not just the weight of knowledge in their packs, but the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. They had found humanity's legacy, preserved through ages by those who had come before. Now it was their turn to be its guardians, to help guide humanity back toward knowledge it had once possessed, one careful step at a time. The construction site where it had all started would remain unfinished, marked as a historical preservation area. The government would continue to study the original safe, unaware that it had served its true purpose, leading the right people to the real treasury of knowledge. And in universities, construction sites, and archaeological digs around the world, small pieces of ancient wisdom would gradually begin to emerge, guided by three unlikely guardians who had proved themselves worthy of humanity's greatest legacy.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.